I call to order the 671st meeting of the Committee on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. The committee will now proceed with agenda item 9 and hold a follow-up dialogue on the inquiry report of United Kingdom. We will now interact with organizations of persons with disabilities and civil society organizations. This is a public meeting. Captioning, international sign, and interpretation in English, French, Spanish, and Arabic are available. This meeting is also webcast on UN Web TV. I welcome representatives of organizations of persons with disabilities and civil society organizations. The format of our interaction is as follows. I'll give the floor to our distinguished persons present in the room for up to 60 minutes. And this is where we'll listen to your statement. Then after that, I will give the floor to the co-rapporteurs, Ms. Laverne Jacobs and Ms. Rosemary Kayes, for their comments and questions. After this, I'll give the floor to other members of the committee for their comments and questions. Then I give the floor back to
still cause death and injury for years to come.
CSOs
we
and
must
OPDs
never accept that attacks on
for
children
comments
are
and
inevitable.
answers.
We must raise our voices.
Now, the floor is open for representatives of organizations of persons with disabilities and civil society. You have the floor, starting by Ellen Clifford, who will hand over to individuals for all of your statements. Madam, you have the floor.
Thank you. Ellen Clifford, UK Deaf and Disabled People's Organisations Coalition. We'd like to start by thanking the Chair, the Committee, the Rapporteurs and the Secretariat for arranging this follow-up to the special inquiry and giving us the opportunity to present our evidence. Those of us here today represent a wide range of organisations and campaign groups run and controlled by deaf and disabled people from across the whole of the UK. We follow the social model of disability, which aligns with human rights approaches. The points we will be making this morning, and those included in our written submission, are the product of extensive consultation and engagement. The issues we will raise must be understood within the context of the devolution framework that operates across the 4 nations of the United Kingdom. Reserved issues are those that have remained under the control of the Westminster government. Legislation and policy set by Westminster can apply to all 4 nations, to Great Britain only, that's England, Scotland and Wales, or just to England and Wales. Where an issue is devolved, it's the responsibility of the national governments in Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales. Westminster also functions as the national government of England. We would like it noted that the substantive issues considered by the original special inquiry investigation come within the purview of the Westminster government. The grave and systematic rights violations found by the previous committee were the result of the austerity framework and welfare reform legislation imposed by Westminster across the UK. It should also be noted that the UK government has in place a reservation and interpretive declaration on Article 24 and is currently investing in new segregated schools. By way of UK overview, there are 5 points we wish to raise. 1, deaf and disabled people's living standards have deteriorated further since 2016. The Westminster Government has failed to implement the committee's recommendations or to reverse the human rights violations identified by the original inquiry. The situation facing us in relation to the issues examined by the inquiry have either remained the same or got progressively worse. Added to this picture, there have been adverse impacts experienced as a consequence of EU withdrawal, and deaf and disabled people have been disproportionately hit by both the COVID-19 pandemic and now by the cost of living crisis. Mitigations introduced from both Westminster and by the devolved nations have been insufficient. 2, the political crisis in Northern Ireland is causing further significant retrogression. 3, Westminster's failure to take action over Article 19 human rights violations has led to breaches of a whole swathe of other articles. Diminishing availability of support to live in the community has made disabled people vulnerable to increased exploitation, abuse and crime, to people becoming institutionalised within their own homes, and has prevented the government from meeting its deinstitutionalisation targets. Conditions within institutions are worsening with endemic abuse and systemic neglect. Westminster refuses to collate data or monitor the impact of social care cuts and charges administered by local authorities. In our written submission, we noted 2 examples where Westminster did not seem to even be aware of the existence of direct payment users living in their own homes. Westminster's Department for Health and Social Care will not engage with deaf and disabled people's organisations in line with General Comment 7. 4, Westminster's new white paper poses a serious threat of further grave and systematic violations. Deaf and disabled people's rights across the whole of the UK are threatened. Their plans include scrapping the work capability assessment and employment and support allowance, the intensification of the sanctions regime, and legislating to abolish blanket exemptions from sanctions to bring all working age deaf and disabled people within the conditionality regime, as well as the introduction of in-work conditionality. All this in addition to the continuing rollout of universal credit, which is a digital by default benefit. Westminster has refused to allow automatic enrolment for those on legacy benefits who lack the support to navigate a new benefit application, placing thousands at risk of destitution. Neither severe nor enhanced disability premia exist under universal credit, adding to disabled people's income losses through welfare reform. 5, the impact on deaf and disabled people of renewed rhetoric from Westminster government ministers, demonising not just out-of-work benefit claimants, but also now disability benefit claimants specifically. The spring 2023 budget emphasised the problem of those who are economically inactive. This message was repeated in the Health and Disability White Paper published the same day. The Minister for Disabled People appeared in a social media video dressed like a police officer, threatening to track down claimants guilty of fraud. Sections of the media have amplified this aggressive approach. One newspaper put up an online calculator for readers to work out how much of their taxes are spent on benefits, along with a series of articles attacking disability benefit claimants. One popular radio phone-in show asked listeners if taxpayers should stop paying for benefits for out-of-work sick and disabled people. Legislation, policy and rhetoric from Westminster aimed at and affecting deaf and disabled people too often prioritises ideological political choices over our human rights. The benefit assessment regime continues to be underpinned by non-human rights compliant model of disability. The white paper is essentially a labour market intervention prompted by a record number of job vacancies and within the context of sustained industrial action from trade unions over pay. The government is worried that there are not enough workers to fill the growing number of bad jobs with insecure hours and low pay. Instead of looking at the reasons behind growing disability prevalence and rising numbers of benefit applications, instead they deny the existence of material barriers to employment that growing numbers of disabled people face. As has been overwhelmingly evident since 2010, this approach leads to deaths and suicides, to avoidable harm and hardship on a mass scale, and to entrenched inequalities and social divisions. I will now pass over to my esteemed colleagues to present overviews from the respective nations and to pick up on individual themes. Scotland has chosen to give its time to reserved issues. I'll now hand over to Greta to talk about the impact of the political crisis in Northern Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you, Ellen. Greta, Gurklyte, Disability Action, Northern Ireland. Thank you for the opportunity to address the committee. Disabled people are very disappointed that the UK government has chosen not to participate in this special inquiry. Northern Ireland is experiencing a severe political and economic crisis, which is having a severe, disproportionate and cumulative impact on disabled people. Northern Ireland is experiencing austerity on overdrive. This combined with the impact of cost of living emergency, health emergency and housing emergency has left disabled people in precarious position. The rights of disabled people are being grave and systematically violated as a result of ongoing crisis. The Westminster government has not allocated enough resources to deliver public services. There is a shortfall of at least 0.8 billion. This has resulted in services being cut at an alarming rate. The implementation of a budget in Northern Ireland by the Westminster government has resulted in civil servants taking decisions to cut services which disabled people in Northern Ireland are reliant on for independent living. These actions are in a breach of Article 19 of the United Nations Convention on Rights of People with Disabilities. The contributors to this report question the legal capacity of civil servants to take decisions normally reserved for ministers, which severely erode the rights of disabled people in Northern Ireland. The Westminster government enacted legislation to enable civil servants to make some decisions. That legislation states that these decisions must be in the public interest. Decisions which leave disabled people without access to housing adaptations, transport, and mobility aids are not in the public interest and must be challenged. We would ask the committee to seek that the Westminster government immediately allocates the necessary resources for public services to Northern Ireland and takes action to ensure that we have a government. Decades of austerity have led to a housing and health emergency in Northern Ireland. Disabled people have been told to discharge from hospital into residential homes, which is leading to re-institutionalization of disabled people at a time when abuse allegations are soaring. Disabled people are living in unsafe and undignified homes due to the lack of accessible housing, with many waiting up to 3 years for adaptations in the private sector. Homelessness is soaring. The cost of living emergency has placed disabled people at risk of destitution, with many starving and reliant on food banks. Disabled people have been subject to paramilitary exploitation, leading to abuse and blackmail for medication. My UK-wide colleagues have demonstrated the extent of rights violations that are occurring as a result of the social security system. We need urgent action to protect rights of disabled people and that includes legislative protections to ensure that rights are enforceable and can be enjoyed. I'm going to pass over to my colleague Megan Thomas. Thank you.
Hi, Megan Thomas from Disability Wales. The Welsh population is disproportionately disabled and impoverished. Over a fifth of the Welsh population identifies as disabled. Statistics from the Joseph Rowntree Foundation shows us that 24% of Welsh households live in poverty. They also show us that if your household contains at least one disabled person, you are more likely to fall into this group. Although welfare is not a devolved matter, the Welsh Government does have some Welsh-specific benefits. However, these are short-term measures and many long-term poverty-alleviating measures still lie within the UK Government. There are serious consequences to the poverty levels in Wales. In the aftermath of the cost of living crisis, we found a burgeoning mental health crisis. One disabled person told us of a disabled friend who had taken their own life after feeling like a financial burden on their partner and children. Article 27 is mostly reserved. In March 2020, it was found that only 50% of disabled people in Wales aged 16 to 64 were in employment, whereas for non-disabled people in Wales, this figure was 81%. There is limited Welsh-specific data on the nature of this work, and research from the Trade Union Congress shows us that this work is more likely to be low-wage and insecure. We are concerned that disabled people's Article 19 rights are not being met in Wales. We have repeated testimony from disabled people who have been forced to move away from loved ones or to have to live in unsuitable, unsafe accommodation. One disabled person told us that there was no suitable accommodation available in the area. They were threatened with a court order after refusing to move away from their support network. People with learning disabilities have reported being placed into secure mental health units due to a lack of appropriate housing and care options. And we are very concerned at evidence from Learning Disability Wales, which tells us that black people are disproportionately restrained in mental health settings. The cost of living crisis has exacerbated previous issues of access to support services. One disabled person told us that they had to start using their personal independence payment on household bills instead of vital therapies. We are concerned about the backtrack in disability rights during the coronavirus pandemic. By June 2021, 68% of coronavirus deaths in Wales were disabled people. In the 2021 Programme for Governance, the Welsh Government committed to incorporating the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Disabled People. But nearly 2 years on from that commitment, we have no update on the timeframe for incorporation. The Welsh Government's ambition to be a leader in human rights has not translated into improving the lives of disabled people in Wales, and the impact of UK Government policies in Wales, as it has been across the UK, has been and is devastating for disabled people and shows no signs of changing. And I would like to hand over to my colleague Kamran Mallick.
Kamran Mallick, Disability Rights UK. Despite being one of the richest countries in the world the UK government governs, it has failed to create a society where disabled people flourish and are treated as valued and equal citizens. Every social, economic or emotional well-being indicator finds disabled citizens lagging far behind the non-disabled population. The situation is desperate and worsening. There is no sign of improvement. There are indications that this is worse in England than in other nations. A public spending analysis published in 2018 showed that public service cuts had impacted disabled people more steeply in England than in Wales or Scotland. Some devolved nation governments have introduced measures such as retaining the Independent Living Fund for existing recipients and engaging with deaf and disabled people over how to embed the convention within devolved policy making. Between 2010 and 2020, the UK government slashed state benefits for disabled people, leaving those unable to work due to impairments or health conditions or due to employer discrimination without adequate incomes. During this era, we saw the rise of food banks, with the majority of users being disabled people. Budgets for social care, children with special educational needs and disability, and access to work fund failed to meet demand, leaving many disabled people without vital support. We know from evidence to the COVID public inquiry that the needs of disabled people were not considered during pre-pandemic planning. During the crisis, the UK government failed to engage with disabled people, used patronising language which denied our humanity and agency, failed to increase benefit levels, failed to protect disabled people receiving care in residential homes or the community, and failed to implement the public sector duty or reasonable adjustments under the Equality Act. Almost 60% of deaths from COVID were those of disabled people. As food, energy and housing costs have soared in 2022, we again saw UK government's disregard for disabled people. In April 2022, benefit levels were raised by just over 3% when inflation was over 10%. No targeted financial support was provided to disabled people who used additional energy due to mobility or health-related equipment or for health reasons. Public and private rents were allowed to soar. No provisions were made for disabled people with higher food costs due to dietary needs, inability to cook from scratch or to access the cheapest stores. Between 2019 and 2023, several policy initiatives have not only failed to tackle systemic inequalities and injustices, but made matters even worse. A national disability strategy that didn't involve disabled people and set out largely low-level departmental actions, a social care white paper that failed to tackle the underfunding of social care, and an education white paper that weakened existing rights, failed to close the special educational needs and disability funding gap, and boosted the building of segregated schools, and a benefits white paper that proposed removing protections and increasing exposure to sanctions. The UK government is fully aware of the mountain of evidence showing the poor life chances and outcomes for its 14 million disabled citizens, but consistently fails to act. It fails to take seriously its commitments to the UN CRPD and to you. It fails to take seriously its duty to improve the life chances of every disabled citizen in the UK. It refuses to support deaf and disabled people's organisations and engage with us in structured, meaningful ways. I would now like to pass over to my colleague, Mark Harrison.
Mark Harrison, Reclaiming Our Futures Alliance, a network of disabled people's organisations in England. Independent living for disabled people has continued to deteriorate since 2016 as the government has ignored Article 19 and the findings of the UN inquiry. Whilst being included in the community is much more than social care, it is the crisis in social care which dominates our lives. Disabled people are dying on waiting lists, either waiting to be assessed or waiting for services. According to Age UK, 28,890 older disabled people died in 2021-22 without ever receiving the care and support they were waiting for. This equates to 79 deaths a day, 554 deaths a week, and 2,408 a month. In England, more than 1 in 4, 28% of people who had asked for social care assessment had been waiting 6 months or more to get one. This means that millions struggling to do ordinary things like going to the toilet, eating, dressing or washing because they require some help to do so. Local authorities are planning another £2.5 billion worth of cuts over the next 2 years, including social care cuts of £467 million. Increasing numbers of residential and community support providers are handing back contracts to government to deliver social care packages not viable at the current levels of funding, deepening the waiting list crisis. Social care support hours have steadily been cut over the last 13 years, leaving people in the community living effectively becoming institutionalised in their own homes. One of the most pernicious aspects of this crisis is charging for social care, which is a tax on disability. The impact of rising social care charges results in disabled people either being pushed into debt or giving up the services that they're entitled to and out of the social care system altogether. In 2020, the High Court ruled that Norfolk County Council's policy discriminated against severely disabled people because the council would be charging those with the highest support needs proportionally more than those with lower support needs. The same council took the direct payment support service away from the local disabled people's organisation in 2017-2018 to run it in-house. Service users have experienced a reduction in service quality and a loss of choice and control as a result. Austerity has also precipitated a deaths crisis in mental health, as I reported to you in 2016-17. The Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust is the worst in the country. Cuts led to the closure of community services used by the most vulnerable patients and service users. This led to a completely needless rise in unnecessary deaths. In April 2022, the Norfolk and Suffolk Foundation Trust was rated inadequate for the 4th time, and campaigners stated that there had been 2,600 deaths. An independent review was commissioned by the NHS, carried out by Grant Thornton accountants, and they found 8,440 deaths in 3.5 years. When we consulted our ROFA members, they told us, what's the point of having accessible transport and access to jobs if we can't get out of bed or leave our houses because of the lack of social care support? I'm now going to hand over to Michael Lorimer.
The Omnibus Partnership Northern Ireland. Social care is a key component in ensuring disabled people can live independently and are included in the community. Without sustainable social care, many will not even get beyond their front doors to exercise their other rights. Austerity imposed by the Westminster government over 13 years has impacted on services in Northern Ireland, preventing any progress towards the full implementation of Article 19. Since the 2016 committee report, the situation has worsened, not least for those seeking support for the first time. People are in hospital or being forced into care homes against their wishes due to the lack of care packages. Existing users of services have also seen a deterioration. In 2022, the Omnibus Partnership hosted focus groups with the Department of Health about the reform of adult social care in Northern Ireland. Disabled people's experiences of domiciliary care services included services changed at short notice without consultation, services removed at short notice without consultation. People offered no choice in how or where their care is provided, including being forced into using direct payments or into care homes against their wishes. A feeling of a power imbalance between people providing and those using services. The political situation has contributed to the regression in disabled people's right to live independently. No devolved government for most of the period since 2016 has severely curtailed our ability to change the situation. Despite this, grassroots DPOs and disabled people in Northern Ireland have achieved significant progress through establishing positive connections with local ministers, politicians and civil service. This includes the proposal to reopen the Independent Living Fund to new applicants, reaching ministerial level but awaiting budget. The formation of a regional disabled people's health and social care forum comprising of disabled people and senior officials. The substantial increase in the rate of direct payments and self-directed support to help and retain and recruit personal assistants. It is imperative that we do not lose such positive examples of General Comment number 7 in practice. We are faced with a Westminster imposed budget requiring savings and including proposals such as introducing charging for domiciliary care. Without dramatic change, further regression in our right to live independently in Northern Ireland is inevitable. We must fight this and forge alliances with disabled people and non-disabled people who will work with us to do so. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Linda Burnip.
Hello, I'm Linda Burnip from Disabled People Against Cuts, and I'm going to talk about the crisis caused by the EU withdrawal and PA recruitment. The impact of EU withdrawal was severely worsened due to the pandemic, which has led to an even greater crisis in social care and PA recruitment. In 2021 to 22, there were 165,000 vacant posts in the social care sector, which has since risen 55% to 220,000 unfilled posts. Disabled people living in their own homes and employing PAs through a social services direct payment or continuing healthcare personal budget face even greater barriers to recruitment than pre-EU withdrawal, especially as they are individual employers. Declaring social care a shortage occupation alone wouldn't help, as individual employers cannot sponsor workers to come to the UK in any sector. Prior to the EU settlement scheme being put in place, neither disabled PA employers or deaf and disabled people's organisations were consulted by Westminster Government or the Migration Advisory Committee. The Migration Advisory Committee are a group of academics who advise the government on shortage occupations, but when we met with them in 2021, they had no idea that any disabled people were individual employers who have to employ PAs directly. Most people employing live-in PAs or live-in social care staff have high support needs, which if not met could be a life or death situation or lead to hospitalisation, yet neither the Migration Advisory Committee nor the government have put anything in place post-Brexit to enable easier recruitment of staff for individual PA users. The deadline to apply to work in the UK without settled, pre-settled or frontier worker status was June 30th, 2021, and to be eligible people had to be working in the UK before December 2020. Many social care staff, however, missed out on the opportunity to work in the UK before December due to COVID, and the government refused to extend the deadline to apply. Even without COVID, the Joint Council for the Welfare of Immigrants said 1 in 3 social care workers hadn't heard of the EU settlement scheme, and many who had didn't understand what they had to do to apply. As well as the Association of Directors of Adult Social Services, we called for a specific route which was non-sponsored and suitable for individual employers to use, but this was ignored by both the Migration Advisory Committee and the government. Disabled people in the UK, however, must not be allowed to be collateral damage for the Westminster Government's obsession to end freedom of movement. And I would like to hand over to Adam Gabsi.
Gabsi, Inclusion London. The UK is in the midst of a deep, complex and decade-long housing crisis and is causing misery for millions of disabled people. There is a chronic shortage of accessible social housing which disabled people need the most due to the affordability and security of this tenure. Current housing stock across Britain is not accessible or adapted to meet disabled people's requirements. In England, only 9% of homes offer minimal accessibility features. Over 400,000 wheelchair users are living in homes which are neither adapted nor accessible. 20,000 people on English local authority waiting lists for a fully wheelchair accessible home. A further 104,000 people are waiting for an accessible or adaptable home. Problems with housing are compounded by local authority and housing association failures to carry out repairs and maintenance. Conditions such as water penetration, damp, mould and pest infestations exacerbate existing impairments while creating others. Outsourcing practices contribute to building failures, including the Grenfell disaster. Grenfell survivors describe how the local authority outsourced contract to private companies to work on their estate. This leads on to the subject of PEEPS, which is an acronym for Personal Emergency Evacuation Plan. 72 people died in Grenfell Tower. 15 of those people have mobility impairments and were unable to escape due to the lack of a plan. I am a wheelchair user who has been housed in a 6th floor flat. The 2 lifts in my building are perpetually out of order, leaving me unable to escape in case of an emergency. The situation in my building highlights an issue for many disabled people living in unsuitable housing. A question I can't seem to get my head around is, how can a landlord put a value on my tenancy but no value on my life? Last year, I was part of a group that took the UK government to the High Court over their failure to implement PEEPs as recommended by Phase 1 of the Grenfell inquiry, the outcome of which is nothing short of a political disgrace, which is Westminster government have made the political choice not to implement this basic recommendation that would give hundreds of thousands of disabled tenants some peace of mind, avoiding accountability, similar to the government's lack of attendance today. You cannot have systematic change by voluntary actions. We as disabled people expect better leadership. I now hand over to my colleague Dorothy Gould.
Thank you. Dorothy Gould from Liberation. I'll be talking about the Westminster Government's draft mental health bill for England and Wales. The government is promoting this bill as a major step forward from existing law, the Mental Health Act 1983, but in reality the bill remains non-compliant both with Article 19 and with Recommendation 114C in the inquiry report. And that will be so even if the government adopts further recommendations from the Parliamentary Committee which has scrutinised the bill. Key concerns for Liberation are that, like planned and new mental health law in the rest of the UK, the bill is still based on a medical instead of a social model approach, non-compliant with the committee's deinstitutional guidelines, as well as Article 19 and General Comment 5, a mental capacity instead of a legal capacity approach in breach of Article 12(2), the assumption that people with psychosocial disabilities and many with intellectual disabilities should still be forcibly detained and treated in psychiatric hospitals to protect themselves and others, even though this contravenes both Article 19 and Articles 12, 13 and 14 and has no adequate research basis in any case. The government has misguidedly maintained too that the need to end disability-based detention and forced treatment is not intrinsic to the Convention, just an interpretation from the CRPD committee. The draft bill is also based on a failure to acknowledge that recent appalling evidence of neglect, abuse and high levels of deaths among detained patients also makes absolutely clear how essential it is to enact completely new mental health law which complies with the Convention. There's a failure to include an intersectional focus in the bill, a complete lack of acknowledgement that not only should disability-based detention and forced treatment end, but that, in line with the committee's deinstitutional guidelines, reparation should be available for the human rights violations intrinsic to these. In breach as well of Articles 4.3 and 33.3, there's been a failure throughout the government's consultation processes to give meaningful weight to those of us with psychosocial and intellectual disabilities who've campaigned tirelessly for mental health law to comply with the CRPD. Until it does, independent living and community inclusion on an equal basis with others will not be a reality for us. I'd now like to hand over to my colleague Keith Lynch.
I am Keith Lynch from People First Scotland. People First Scotland celebrate all that members of our organisation do. In stark contrast, we find little to celebrate in our overall life experience. So little change in the rules, laws and policies that restrict, dictate and limit our lives. Our rights are discussed or written about by others, but meaningful involvement in policy and decision making is still not happening for us. Day to day, dignity and respect is denied learning disabled citizens. Services do not support our right to independent living. We are unsupported as parents. Support is inadequate for family life. Our children are removed from our care. We are ignored as the unemployed. Scotland's low expectations vividly illustrated by less than 7% of us in paid employment. As women and girls, we continue to be abused, facing barriers to services throughout life. Still not believed when we report. Accessible information is really provided. That barrier negatively impacts our well-being and health. We die 20 years younger than citizens without learning disability. Our COVID infection rate was 3 times that of other people. Our rate of severe outcome or death from COVID twice as high. But we are not a specified priority group for COVID vaccination boosters. Our lives remain valued less than the lives of others. Supported decision making would transform our lives, but is not offered to us. Instead, substitute decision making continues. Our dignity is denied by grouping us together in legislation designed for those who are mentally ill. Not because those people are any less entitled to dignity. The impairments and life experiences are simply different. If the recent Scott Review recommendations for mental health law are implemented, then we will still be subject to substitute decision making in law. The laws could still detain us in mental health hospitals and institutions for years. Our website countdown clock marks time passing since the government promised to significantly reduce long hospital stays and out-of-area residential placements. Very few months left until the deadline now. Still so many locked away. We do not yet feel confident that the transformational change promised will happen. Scotland can still design and lead change and be the first to get it right. We ask our country to support our decision making and our rights as humans to lead dignified lives. I am now handing over to Rensa.
Thank you. Rensa Gaunt from DPAC, Cambridgeshire. Disabled people make up 22% of the UK population, but made up 60% of COVID-related deaths in England and Wales. This is no coincidence, and our deaths were not inevitable. How did this happen? 1. Our right to life is not upheld or respected. Guidelines for medical professionals from NICE originally recommended that all critical care patients be assessed for how independent they are before they could access critical care, which could have resulted in many hundreds of thousands of disabled people, such as people with learning difficulties, being denied life-saving care. This was only overturned due to campaigning. Blanket do not resuscitate orders were applied unlawfully and inappropriately. It's assumed that our lives are not worth living or of equal value. This is not challenged by government and is encouraged through austerity. Disabled people and our organisations must be given the resources and opportunities to challenge this narrative. 2. Our right to access is not upheld or respected. To take one example, for many deaf people, information in English is not accessible. The Westminster Government had to be forced by the High Court to provide critical COVID information briefings in British Sign Language, by which time there was only one briefing left. The Scottish and Welsh governments provided this access without being taken to court. This is just one example of how the Westminster Government systematically disregard disabled people's rights until they're forced to change. 3. Our right to health is not upheld or respected. Social care support was reduced or suspended during the pandemic, contributing to the 50% rise in deaths among social care recipients living in the community. Only 9% of these deaths were actually related to COVID. Many deaths were attributed to thirst, as basic care was not provided. We are seen as acceptable collateral damage. Healthcare waiting lists reach record lengths and remain dangerously long. Staff are overstretched and unable to dedicate the time needed to keep disabled patients healthy and safe. And this especially impacts the most marginalised among us. We're experiencing higher levels of mental distress without appropriate support available to us in the way we need it. No rights are afforded to those who must continue to shield, as vital protections and prevention measures have been wound down. Many of us are not able to participate in the job market, as inadequate adjustments have been made for us, and social security leaves us in poverty. Through COVID, these 3 examples have shown that disabled people and our rights are dismissed at every turn. The government handling of the pandemic, austerity and underfunding, then and now, are political choices which impact disabled people disproportionately. Our rights are implemented only if funding allows, and the rhetoric of austerity ensures that cannot happen. Only when Westminster Government is forced to take action will our human rights be taken seriously. I'll now hand over to John McCardle.
Madam Chairperson, ladies and gentlemen, members of the committee, since we were here 7 years ago, little has changed for the better in the United Kingdom for disabled people. The Fit for Work Capability Assessment, WCA, regime, labelled a human catastrophe for disabled people by the former chair of this committee, Thérèse Desjardins, has remained in place. Multitudes of individuals continue to be wrongly judged fit for work or for work-related activity by the for-profit private companies appointed by the Westminster Government to carry out its dirty work. If there has been just one positive, it has been in the percentages of sick and/or disabled people who have been successful in their appeals at the Tribunal and Court Service Social Security tribunals. The government now admits that it has squandered £2 billion of public money fighting sick and/or disabled people through the courts. Money it says it now wants to recover. What is meant by this? How does the government intend to cut out this loss? The situation is as follows. Sick and/or disabled people and their advocates have been largely successful on appeal to tribunal by relying on the existence of an at first little-known legal regulation buried in the relevant legislation that states that a person shall not be found fit for work or to have limited capability for work if there would be a substantial risk of harm either to the individual or to others. The government has effectively conceded defeat by their announcement in the Health and Disability White Paper that the work capability assessment is to be scrapped. However, the government has not given up on its objective to further slash the social security safety net to those in society who need it the very most, chronically ill and/or disabled people. Thanks largely to the efforts of Black Triangle campaign, the British Medical Association voted unanimously that the work capability assessment be immediately scrapped to be replaced by a rigorous and safe system that does not cause avoidable harm to some of the weakest and most vulnerable members of society. The UK government has announced that it will accede to the scrapping of the WCA. Yet, what it intends to replace it with will certainly not be a rigorous and safe system. It will be one that doesn't even contain this minimal substantial risk assessment requirement. Without this basic requirement, any replacement under universal credit will be neither humane nor human rights compliant. It will be a full frontal assault on our disability rights and an abrogation and repudiation of this convention. For if we are now to live under a system that refuses to acknowledge when we are too ill or physically and/or mentally impaired to work, then it will be a system in which disabled people cease to be disabled for the purposes of the realisation of the right to social welfare under this convention. We are looking down the barrel at a human catastrophe of biblical proportions if these plans go ahead in their present form. This is the reality that we now face. With the WCA gone and the rule of law to contend with, the State Party will be free to impose conditionality upon sick and disabled people, such as that they are unable to fulfil. This will be carried out by a work coach, a DWP, Department of Work and Pensions bureaucrat with no medical qualifications or expertise whatsoever. The number of avoidable deaths as a direct result of the failure of this wicked assessment among our people continues to rise apace. See in evidence submitted the work by Dr. China Mills, Professor of Public Health, and John Pring, Editor of Disability News Service, Deaths by Welfare Timeline. Rather than listening to us and working with us to ensure a rigorous and safe system that doesn't cause avoidable harm, the UK government has made a policy decision that guarantees turning the human catastrophe of the WCA into something apocalyptic. We call upon this committee to condemn the United Kingdom government's plans and to make a public declaration that such plans, were they to be implemented, will be a clear breach of this convention and will amount to an abrogation and repudiation of the letter and spirit of it. All devolved national governments and peoples have no power at all to interfere with this process. The responsibility lies solely with the United Kingdom government at Westminster, and it is that government and that government alone that this committee and the United Nations must hold to account in the deliberation and adjudication of this extremely urgent matter. Thank you. I'd like to introduce Paul Ntulila, Disabilities Sheffield. Thank you.
Hello? Can you hear this one?
I'll start again. Hello everyone, my name's Paul Ntulila and I'm representative of a disabled organisation based in Sheffield. And the context I would like to deliver is about poverty, and it's not good news, I'm afraid. 7.2 million people in households with a disabled person are living in poverty. This accounts for just over 10% of the UK's population, but half of all of the UK's poverty. Deaf and disabled people are almost 3 times as likely to live in material deprivation than the rest of the population. Benefits in the UK are comparatively low by international standards, with one of the lowest rates relative to the average earnings. Analysis of the cumulative impact of tax and welfare reform changes between 2010 to 2021, commissioned by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, showed that deaf and disabled people are as among the biggest losers. The more disability within a household, the higher the annual cash loss. The 4-year benefit freeze from 2016 to 2020 affected 27 million people, with sweeping another 400,000 into poverty. It is not true that this did not affect disabled people. Around half of its claimants hit by the benefit freeze could not afford essentials. Benefits have not been restored to their real term value. During the pandemic, the Westminster government introduced a temporarily pandemic uplift to universal credit of £20 per week. This was not applied to over 2.2 million claimants on legacy benefits. 3/4 of these were deaf and disabled people. Many of these had significantly increased expenditures due to COVID-19. For example, having to buy their own personal protective equipment for personal assistance coming into their homes. The explanation was that the uplift was for people who work. This reinforced our sense that our lives are not valued unless we're of economic value. Deaf and disabled people are disproportionately impacted by the cost of living emergency, and we are more likely to live in poverty with no savings. The unavoidable extra costs of disability have also increased dramatically in the recent years. In a survey, over 75% of respondents reported that they were going without or cutting back on essentials like food, energy, and as medication and personal hygiene items. The crisis is also having consequences on deaf and disabled's rights to live in their home of their choosing, as well as increasing the abuse and exploitation of deaf and disabled people who are more likely to live in most disadvantaged areas. The measures taken by Westminster government and mitigations by the devolved governments are simply not adequate. The UK government's attitude is that the way to climb out of poverty is through hard work, but this is not an option for many of us. Deaf and disabled people are overrepresented among workers on low pay, and the disability pay gap has continued to widen. Proposals in the new Health and Disability White Paper threatens to reduce the income of hundreds and thousands of deaf and disabled people who barely or who already face significant barriers to employment, such as a lack of accessible information, for instance provided in British Sign Language, despite the fact that it is recognised as one of the official languages of Great Britain by the UK Parliament in April 2022. Thank you very much, and now I pass on to my colleague, Avril Lewis.
Avril Lewis, DPAC. Deaf and disabled people's organisations and trade unions are deeply worried about plans the Westminster government is currently enacting across the UK to extend the scope of conditionality, including to those in work on low incomes. This is where benefit claimants have to comply with mandatory work search activity or have their benefits stopped. Claimants in work will be made to look for more hours of work or higher paying jobs. The government has steadily increased the number of claimants who will be subject to in-work conditionality once it is fully rolled out, beginning with 794,000 claimants from September 2023. Once rolled out, it will affect a total of 1,724,000 claimants, of which 27% are disabled. This means around 465,000 disabled claimants will be subject to work search activity on top of their paid jobs. In addition to this, from July this year, 700,000 lead carers for children became subject to conditionality. Of these, 630,000 are women and 230,000 are disabled. Many of these claimants will be unable to take on more hours of work or to manage the work search requirements on top of their existing jobs and or caring responsibilities due to the disabling barriers they face and for impairment or illness related reasons. These claimants face the same issues such as digital exclusion that out-of-work claimants experience, yet the government has failed to put in place appropriate mitigations to safeguard them from sanctions. The Department for Work and Pensions Equality Impact Assessment for in-work progression vastly underestimates the numbers of disabled people who will be affected, ignoring the department's own figures. Employers are not prepared for what is about to happen. I will now pass over to Michael Holden.
Of Independent Living in Northern Ireland. In the United Kingdom, work and employment is overseen by the Department for Work and Pensions in Great Britain, whilst in Northern Ireland it is devolved to the Department of Communities. As a disabled businessman and employer, I give agency to the fact that both departments have created barriers for employment as well as self-employment. Targeted funding cuts in access to work programmes have seen waiting times increase, and as applications may only be made after employment is secured, this leads to delays before employers see the benefit of offering employment. Alongside this, the cuts have also curtailed the number of applicants admitted to the programmes and reduced the level of support being offered, which really magnifies the risks for employers. Vocational and technical training in further education centres are not party to these same access to work schemes, so employers are required to make additional individual applications with separate assessments being required. Compounding this are minimum academic achievements being necessary before any candidates can be admitted. Those seeking self-employment or having an entrepreneurial spark are hindered by the lack of tailored support within regional economic development units, with mentors who have little regard or knowledge for adjustments needed to accommodate any business idea or plans. With networking events or business seminars that are inaccessible, the opportunities to the disabled community are disadvantageous. Many disabled people across the United Kingdom find themselves in the 7th level of hell on a continual, unpaid life of work experience and return to work placements, which offer no genuine, fulfilling outcomes as a means of escape, with deliverance into life-fulfilling work roles. The government's approach to disability employment in Great Britain has seen a minuscule decrease in the employment gap, whilst in Northern Ireland, where we have no government currently, the employment gap has surged to 42.2 percentage points. Integrated into everything employment related is the exclusion of a cohesive, accessible public transportation system, one that is fit for purpose in rural communities, has no limitation on the number of disabled users, and provides equity in an eco-sustainable manner. This creation of an overburdensome and bureaucratic system that in effect becomes a barrier to employers selecting a potential individual, or the lack of support for self-employment in Northern Ireland is set to continue, as last week we saw the abandonment of the Disability Employment Forum in direct contravention of General Comment number 7. I would like to pass over to my colleague, Tony O'Reilly.
Distinguished speakers, we are running out of time, so I really appeal to Tony and Martha to be really quick. Thank you.
We stop now. We've run out of time. Tony O'Reilly, Northern Ireland. Oh,
You
apologies,
go on and
sorry.
Martha goes on, just that we make it as quick as possible. Thank you.
West Forum of People with Disabilities, Northern Ireland. Deaf and disabled people in Northern Ireland have faced budget cuts to essential services, as highlighted earlier, including the social security budget due to the current political situation here, where we have no government. Civil servants are in the process of making a decision to cut discretionary support provision, which helps people on low incomes with short-term living expenses, which is now going to be cut by over 50%. Previously, you could apply for support several times a year. Now it's every 2 years. Government advises that 57% of all recipients are deaf and disabled people. Those of us on universal credit and low incomes and other means-tested benefits. The Trussell Trust Food Network in Northern Ireland research estimates that 61% of us are deaf and disabled people or care for someone who is a deaf and disabled person or child. Key systemic failings of our social security system is like other parts of the UK. Income levels on social security forcing disabled and deaf people into poverty and hardship. Both the anti-poverty and disability strategies driven by deaf and disabled people and our allies in Northern Ireland have not been adopted to address this. And indeed, the disability strategy and anti-poverty strategies look as if they're going to be folded. The absence of a deaf and disabled people in influencing the social security system and how it operates, in our view, is in direct violation of Article 4.3 of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and is contrary to the Disability Strategy Expert Panel and Steering Group recommendations to help address the failings of the social security system and the benefit processes. To date, there is no cumulative impact assessment published in Northern Ireland on the effects of these cuts to the social security system on deaf and disabled people. Future reforms to social security, as highlighted in the Green and White Papers on work, health and disability, promise more cuts and fundamental breaches of our human rights. Deaf and disabled people living in Northern Ireland feel isolated from decision-making and excluded from influencing the social security system, contrary to General Comment number 7, especially in the absence of a devolved government and accountability here. Thank you. I now call on Martha Foulds.
Thank you very much. Martha Foulds on behalf of DPAC Sheffield. Deaf and disabled people are concerned that the Equality and Human Rights Commission is not able to adequately fulfil its role as a national human rights institution for England and Wales, having experienced a cut in budget from £62 million in 2010 to £17.4 million by 2020. The EHRC Disability Advisory Committee was scrapped without any consultation with deaf and disabled people's organisations, and there exists widespread dismay at the EHRC's refusal to carry out an inquiry into the deaths of benefit claimants. In 2021, DDPOs were commissioned by the EHRC to draft a shadow report under the Convention in expectation of the periodic review. The funding was insufficient to afford a credible level of accessibility, requiring our overstretched organisations to supplement the funding from our own overstretched resources. Despite vigorous research coding, we experienced pressure to skew our findings, and we were not allowed to include examples and anecdotes from lived experience. Over recent years, the EHRC has become detached from the everyday realities of deaf and disabled people's lives. There is a stark difference from the levels of engagement with DDPOs in the devolved nations. The England Commission does not work in co-production, and officers do not want to hear of disabled people's lived experience. Previous work, such as the 2018 inquiry into housing and disabled people following a meeting between deaf and disabled people's organisations and the EHRC, was much more effective. We share the concerns of LGBT organisations with relation to the EHRC's position on trans equality and support their decision to seek the removal of the AAA rating by the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Instruments. We agree with the United Kingdom Independent Mechanism Evidence Report that there has been little to no progress in implementing the committee's recommendations. However, the report fails to reflect the gravity of the situation that people continue to face. The substantive issues reserved to Westminster, with which the inquiry dealt, were avoided, with the word count given up to devolved issues. Finally, the threat of further rights violations presented by the White Paper are only included within half a footnote. Thank you, Chair. Thank you, members of the committee. This concludes our submission on behalf of civil society.
I thank all our distinguished speakers for this informative presentations. Before we continue, I wish to put forward this clarification that the UK government requested postponement of the participation to the March 2024 session, and that this request was granted during the intersessional period. Now I would like to give the floor to co-rapporteurs for their comments and questions. Ms. Jacobs, you please have the floor for 10 minutes.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Good morning to everyone. It's a distinct honor to be here with you and to serve in the capacity of co-rapporteur for the follow-up to the UK inquiry with my colleague Rosemary Caius. Thank you for all of your comments so far. Under Article 6 of the optional protocol of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, an inquiry may be initiated if the committee receives reliable information excuse me, indicating that rights under the Convention are being systemically violated by a state party. In 2016, by way of background, this committee issued a report after conducting an inquiry into the cumulative impact of the legislation, policies, and measures adopted by the UK relating to social security schemes and to work and employment from 2010 to the date of adoption of the report. There are three main articles of the Convention that are at the core of this inquiry: the enjoyment of the right to live independently and to be included in the community, Article 19, the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection, Article 28, and the right to work and employment, Article 27. After an extensive investigation which included a country visit, the committee issued its report, which contains 11 recommendations. I thank all of the persons with disabilities, representatives of organizations of persons with disabilities, and of civil society organizations who have spoken with us today and who have taken the time to reach out to us in different ways. We appreciate your input, and your comments are vital. I have a few questions relating to Article 28 on the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection, as well as on Article 27 on the right to work and employment. Article 28, titled Adequate Standard of Living and Social Protection, indicates that states parties recognize the right to an adequate standard of living for persons with disabilities and their families, including adequate food, clothing, and housing, and to the continuous improvement of living conditions, and that states parties will take appropriate steps to safeguard and promote the realization of this right without discrimination on the basis of disability. As it's a lengthy article, I'll summarize by saying that Article 28 further recognizes the right to social protection and includes a specific requirement that states parties ensure access by women and girls with disabilities as well as older persons with disabilities to social protection programs and poverty reduction programs. Now, oftentimes, flaws in disability benefit programs are related to three main stages of income support programs generally. These three stages are: first, determining the amount of disability benefits; second, assessing individuals for eligibility; and third, finding constructive and unharmful processes to ensure that one is eligible to continue to receive benefits. These three stages engage questions such as what tests should be applied in the assessment of eligibility? How do we ensure that the tests applied are devoid of the medical model? How do we ensure that the processes involved do not have a negative impact on deaf persons and on individuals with disabilities who are multiply marginalized? And how do we ensure that amounts provided are adequate and oppose countervailing forces such as clawbacks? In your presentations today, you have touched on these issues, but I'd like to take some time to go a bit deeper. My first set of questions deal with Article 28, the right to an adequate standard of living and social protection. With respect to my first question, a number of you have spoken about the extent of poverty among persons with disabilities, a poverty that was exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and caused significant harm to the lives of persons with disabilities, not only economically, but also physically and psychologically. So my question is, what would be the best way for the government to remedy this situation at this point in time? Would it be to provide supplementary benefits now at a later stage, to offer remedies through compensation, or perhaps something else altogether? I'm very interested to hear your views from your experiences as persons with disabilities and representative organizations of persons with disabilities. My second question is, could you please explain in greater detail the process for obtaining disability-related benefits or income support in your country or nation? Has it changed at all since the inquiry? And if so, how has it changed? How could this process be improved? What would you like to see the government change in the process for obtaining benefits? And for example, the rapporteurs have heard of the Guaranteed Decent Income for Everyone, which provides an amount that is means tested and automatically given to everyone who falls below that level of income. In other words, it sets a minimum income standard. Is this the preferred choice for deaf and disabled persons across the regions? And has this been proposed to government in the context of any type of consultation? My next question is an extension of the last. I would like to know precisely more about the processes being used for benefit assessment as to whether one has a disability to qualify. What kind of impact does this disability assessment process have on you as persons with disabilities, and how could the human rights model be better reflected in this process, in your view, assuming that it's not well reflected at all? Next, I would appreciate more information on the processes for maintaining benefits once you have been approved for the benefit. What do those processes look like in each of your countries or regions, whether it's meeting with caseworkers regularly, filing additional information, having to reapply, or something other? I'd be very interested in learning more about the processes and the kinds of impacts that they have on persons with disabilities who are required to go through them. Finally, on Article 28, I was particularly interested to read a news article published in October 2022 in the Disability News Service, which dealt with the user-led plan to improve Social Security by eliminating universal credit. It was created by the Disability Security Commission in Britain. This article noted that there were difficulties faced by disabled women and people of color in assessing the benefits. And I'll give you a quote. A disabled carer spoke of the problems facing carers, disabled women, and people of color. She said, "Despite disabled women being more likely to be carers, you constantly face discrimination, and it is harder to access the support I require as a disabled person, as it is assumed I can't be disabled and be providing care. And there is institutional racism added to this," she also said. Could you please elaborate on the issues relating to women with disabilities, and particularly racialized women with disabilities, in applying for and accessing disability benefits? This is important as Article 28 asks states parties to ensure access to social protection for women and girls in particular, and our convention aims more generally to take into account intersectionality. So I have a couple of questions on Article 27, and I'll finish with those. Article 27 deals with work and employment, and the first thing I want to say is that it's clear that the negative stereotypes about persons with disabilities who depend on social assistance played a significant role in the need for this inquiry. The 8th recommendation of the inquiry report asks the state party to take measures to combat any negative and discriminatory stereotypes or prejudices against persons with disabilities in public and the media, including the assertion that dependency on benefits is in itself a disincentive to seeking employment, implement and implementing broad mass media campaigns. What are some of the ways that you would suggest to work against negative stereotypes? And that is the end of my questions. Thank you so much for being with us today and for sharing your insights. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Jacobs. I now invite Ms. Kayes to have the floor.
Thank you very much, Chair. And I, along with my colleague Laverne, welcome all the deaf and disabled persons in the room that have joined us from the UK. Being an Australian, I find it interesting to be talking to a devolved UK civil society. I normally have to deal with my own federated problems of having a plenary application at state level and a reserved power at the federal level. But unfortunately, your system is slightly more complex. It's not as straightforward as us Australians. We made it quite simple. The federal government has clear and defined reserve powers, and the states have plenary power in all other areas. So trying to put a clear picture to all of this has been a little bit difficult. So I thank you for the rigorous and solid work that you have done for this inquiry to inform us, to participate and engage. What I want to do in my time is to build a bit of a picture, to get an understanding of where we're at now and where deaf and disabled people in the UK want us to be able to support change to address this situation. Throughout the recommendations by the committee to the UK was engagement with deaf and disabled persons. So what I'd like to understand is what engagement mechanisms were in place. I believe I have the answer to this, that were inquiry specific. Was there a focus? Was there an engagement with the UK in its reserved powers, but then within the devolved national aspects within Northern Ireland, Scotland and Wales and England? And if not, what type of engagement process would you like to see in place? Is there a role for a standing committee that gives representation to deaf and disabled persons, that has an intersectional focus that includes cross-disability organisations of women and girls with disabilities, people of colour with disabilities, gives a focus to LGBTIQ people with disabilities? Is it possible to be able to have that coordinated access to people with disability within the resourcing envelope that is available for disabled persons organisations? And is there a shrinking space for disabled persons organisations within the UK, and a growing role for service providers in terms of having access to engagement with government in terms of policy direction? The other thing I'd like to ask about is the impact and evaluation around the inquiry, and what formal and informal processes were undertaken. I get a sense that there was limited impact and evaluation from governments, but there seems to have been much more informal impact and evaluation. The rigour of your reports, the rigour of the information that we've received from both DPOs and from IMM has been quite commendable. what I'd like to understand is if there's other academic work that you can point the rapporteurs and the rest of the committee to for us to engage in before we speak with the UK government in March. In terms of living independently, Article 19 is a cornerstone article within the Convention. 19, as a person with a disability, I understand, is central to our ability to be able to be true and meaningful participating members of our communities and our societies. I get the sense that there's a creep towards individualisation in terms of benefits and focus for social care within the UK, and that there is a big divide between those that are working on a very individualised mechanism of being sole employers of PAs, and then there is a huge gap to institutionalised frameworks for people living in residential care. Does that focus on individualisation of social care leave people at risk of being institutionalised at home? I get the sense from your information that that is true. Does that also have an impact on the funds and focus that is available for advocacy organisations and representative organisations to be able to support and argue within policy discourse about the weaknesses of an overly independent focus on social care solutions? Also, to what extent is there a growing reconnection between the accommodation and it being tied to supports? And is there valid choice for people to be able to choose where to live and who supports them where they are living? To what extent have austerity measures taken good options out of the market for people in terms of their social care supports, and a growing industry of disability care through big private organisations taken the place of smaller, bespoke, responsive, disability responsive organisations? And is there a level of monetary coercion to pool funding, to pool resources, and to live in congregate situations within that individualised market? Finally, I'd like to pick up on some elements around work and employment. This is a reserved power that, with the white paper and what is proposed in the white paper, seems to look like it's a common thread of social security reform, is about directing it to get people with disability into employment and off welfare. Are these programs, and this white paper in particular, still open for engagement and participation? If they are, at what points do you think there needs to be a rigorous process in which people with disability can engage in this? What has the removal of the European Social Fund meant to long-term employment programs to support, like employability? What is the framework of the replacement funds that the UK government has put forward in terms of the ESF? And Is there greater clarity now of what can be funded under those alternative funds? And is there still an opportunity for deaf and disabled persons to be able to frame those funds to meet longer-term viable employment options? We'd be keen to hear your perspectives on whether any of those elements and how we could frame those elements to put back to the UK and the devolved governments of the United Kingdom. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Case. For the next 10 minutes, I will give the floor to the first 5 members of the committee willing to make comments or raise questions. 2 minutes maximum, please. Please raise your name card. I give the floor to Mr. Samuel Kabwe.
Thank you very much, Madam. You have given us very interesting statistics this morning. You said that during COVID, 70% of the people who died were persons with disabilities. You have talked of also deaths of 28 persons within a period of 2 years. Could you please inform us how these statistics are obtained? What are the sources of this kind of information, and how can we access this information? Thank you very much.
I give the floor to Mr. Floyd Morris.
Very much, Madam Chair, and along the same lines of my colleague Samuel Kabui, the statistics on the COVID-19 pandemic is very concerning and troubling, and I would want to find out from the distinguished delegation. It seems as if there is a major challenge in terms of the health professionals being trained how to relate to persons with disabilities. I want to find out if it is that there is still that deeply entrenched medical model of disability in the British healthcare system that has contributed to this significant death amongst persons with disabilities during the pandemic. And I want to find out as well in terms of what role has parliamentarians with disabilities been playing in assisting the disability movement in the UK to deal with these significant cuts in welfare spending amongst persons with disabilities. Thank you.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ms. Amalia Gamia.
Gracias, señora Presidenta. Thank you, Madam Chair. I'd like to welcome persons with disabilities from the UK and thank them for the wealth of information presented. I have 2 questions. First, if the UK government has already halted the tax levied on persons with disabilities in their homes. The second question that is connected is whether you've already had discussions with the government. I think that there has been some progress because there's a great deal of information here available. And when persons with disabilities enter the labour market, they suffer from a cut in their income because they've taken the decision to go to work. But in the discussions you've had with the government, have you been able to discuss General Comment 8 approved by this committee on Article 27? It was adopted last year. Have you had the opportunity to discuss with the government the guidelines in General Comment 8, which at the moment is not being complied with in the UK? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Ms. Saowalak Thongkuay.
Thank you, Madam Chair.
My question is related to Article 124. Thank you to all organizations or persons with disability for your informative presentations. Contain many challenges that need to be eliminated. Regarding to the facts you have raised, it is important to know that the UA government right now is conducting a consultation to develop a new disability action plan. The plan will set out the immediate actions that the government is taking in 2023 and 2024 to improve the systems, as well as laying the foundations for long-term change. These consultations mark the listening stage. At the moment of the action plan, according to the government website, it stipulated that the government have identified a number of positive actions that might be taken now. So please provide information according to your views and experiences. One, what are critical challenges OPDs have been facing to engage in these consultation and listening processes? And that OPD has an opportunity to discuss with the disability unit to identify issues and disability-specific actions that would be included in the new disability action plan. What mechanisms taken to ensure a close consultation and meaningful participation of OPDs, included deaf community, intellectual, psychosocial disability, to develop these critical new disability action plan and specific actions. Despite of alternative accessible formats of the consultation processes available, does government provide reasonable accommodations in order to facilitate a close consultations of OPDs as its priority obligations? Thank you very much.
Thank you. I give the floor to Sir Robert Martin.
Thank you, Madam Chair. What is being done to provide support, particularly financial, to families to keep people with disabilities with their families? Ultimately, it costs the country less if people remain in their community. People should choose with whom and where they live. And can you please tell us whether and how many persons with disabilities are re-institutionalised? Is this the result of the ROFA reforms? Thank you.
Minutes saved, so I'll please call Mr. Marcos Sheffer and Greta, a minute each, please.
Thank you, Chair. In your presentations, you've delineated certain regressions and deficiencies in social care and support measures. My question is this part of a general trend that we observe in the United Kingdom after COVID and after Brexit with the rising living costs that pertains to everybody, or is this something that specifically and disproportionately pertains to persons with disabilities? And we see that the current government in general does not seem to be very friendly toward requirements from the perspective of human rights, as for example we see with respect to the European Convention on Human Rights, that seems to be perceived as an obstacle and not not what it is. Is this a position that also extends to the CRPD, or does it extend to the CRPD even more than it does to the European Convention? Thank you.
The last speaker is Ms. Gerald Dondovdoj.
Thank you, Chair. One question already raised, so now I have only one question. As I mentioned before, the UK government is not so knowledgeable with the CRPD principle and concept. So my question is there any capacity building program or activities towards the decision makers to ensure that their adopted policies and programs are compliant with the CRPD and more inclusive for persons with disabilities? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I now give the floor back to our distinguished representatives from civil society and OPDs. You have 20 minutes Please raise your nameplate or raise your hand for the floor. And if any of the questions are not answered within the time, kindly submit to us in writing in Word format. Yes, please, you have the floor.
Thank you. So I'm going to start by answering the question around the benefit assessments. So the benefit assessments that we have are reserved with one exception. So that means it's decisions by Westminster Government. We have a benefit assessment for out of work, living costs for disabled people, and we have an extra costs benefit. Scotland now has powers for their own extra costs benefit, and colleagues can say more about that one. The benefit assessments are underpinned by something called a biopsychosocial model of disability, which is not human rights compliant and was developed specifically as part of welfare reform, we would say with the aim of finding ways to deny disability. What the white paper is threatening to do is that under the Westminster Government's current proposals, they will be getting rid of the out-of-work benefit assessment and instead placing everything on the extra costs disability assessment. And they say that this will reduce stress because going through the benefit assessment process is extremely burdensome, time-consuming and very distressing for people. The burden of evidence is on you to collect. The High Court ruled that it discriminates against people living with mental distress, and yet it's still in place the same. We're very worried that if we just have one assessment and we fail that, then we lose all our extra disability income. There are 632,000 disabled people who currently get the out-of-work benefit but not the extra costs benefit. We're very worried what will happen to them. The government is trying to draft legislation for this now. It can't go through in this parliament, but they are trying to draft the legislation now. They have asked some disability organisations to be involved with that, but without any scope for changing the things we are very concerned about. In terms of what we think the government should do as an alternative, it's widely, there's a consensus within civil society that we need a minimum income standard, like the guaranteed decent income that was mentioned, but the government won't listen to any criticisms of their current policies. The Work and Pensions Committee has done a lot of work. They constantly put in recommendations for change, which the government mainly ignore. A very good start would be to abolish sanctions. Sanctions discriminate against disabled people, but instead, along with the white paper, they're going to be intensifying the sanctions regime. In response to the question about women, so there are specific ways in which our benefit assessment system discriminates against women. The Equality and Human Rights Commission carried out a cumulative impact assessment of welfare reform and tax changes when the government wouldn't, and they found that women and disabled people are particularly badly affected. The worst affected are disabled lone parents with disabled children, and they lose about £10,000 a year. Other concerns are that finances are calculated on a household rather than an individual basis, and this can trap women, disabled women, in abusive relationships. We also have the 2-child limit, which means that you cannot get benefits for a third child or anything above 2, and that increases poverty. The only exception is if a woman has been raped, and that's how the third child was conceived, in which case you have to fill in an application form. Quickly, what would a media campaign look like? I think to start with, what we need is equality in hate crime law, so that it would be an offence to stir up disability hate crime. At the moment we have that for race, but we don't have it for disability, and that would mean that a lot of the aggressive rhetoric from politicians and the media would become illegal. As regards the Disability Action Plan, there's really nothing in it that's relevant to the priorities of disabled people. So, for example, the situation where our local authorities are going bankrupt and cannot pay for social care support to live in the community, and the changes coming into social security. Thank you.
Yes, please hand over to our next speaker.
For Disability Wales. So we'll start with the question around devolution and engagement. So what we have noticed is quite a bit of a lack of engagement in terms of with disabled people living in Wales. What we has been responded to when we are in communication with our members and disabled people throughout Wales is feeling quite left behind and disengaged from this process. This is something we've had to repeatedly explain to both disabled people and other disabled people's organisations about exactly what this process looks like. We are quite concerned about the lack of information publicly available to disabled people. In terms of the connection between housing, accommodation and institutionalisation, we absolutely see a connection between the two. We have as mentioned previously, we have had disabled people tell us that they have been almost forced into institutions due to a lack of appropriate accommodation, or have had to move far away from their support networks due to a lack of appropriate accommodation. This is a very large problem in Wales, especially as there is quite poor public transport within Wales, so it can be difficult to move between. So it can be difficult to move between area to area, or you can have poor connections where you are living. Hence, in terms of the EU and replacement funds, especially regarding employment, Wales was very poorly hit by loss of funds from the EU. There was a commitment from the UK government to match those funds. Unfortunately, that commitment has not been met, resulted in some programs receiving less funding. In terms of the mitigations for this, we have seen the Welsh government commit further funds to programs such as Communities for Work, but we are not seeing. But from the UK government, we are not seeing much more mitigation.
Please.
Hello. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the extra cost payments, which is personal independence payments that disabled people receive. You can get this benefit if you're working and also if you're not working. The problem is if you're not working, that money is taken away from you to pay for social care, so you actually don't get it to meet your extra costs of being disabled. People who aren't working and in receipt of social care are left with a minimum income guarantee, which didn't increase for 5 years and then increased this year by 3% when inflation was over 10%. The minimum income guarantee is about £153 a week, which is totally inadequate for people who have extra costs relating to their disability. So if they need electricity to charge hoists, wheelchairs, use kidney dialysis machines, have CPAP or BPAP machines, they just can't afford to use that amount of electricity now, and people are actually turning off their machines and not using them when they should do. It's also led to a lot of people giving up social care, so they're now just trapped at home, and the higher your support needs, the more of your personal independence payment is taken off you. When we did research and asked local authorities how much they charged people and how much of their personal independence payments they took towards paying for their social care, for people with the highest support needs who need overnight care, they take all of your personal independence payment away from you. We only have 2 local authorities in England and Wales who don't charge for social care, and elsewhere. It is really, people's bills have gone up from maybe £70 a week to over £150, £200 a week to pay towards their social care.
John McCardle, Black Triangle Campaign, based in Scotland. With regard to the replacement of the work capability assessment, we would like to, in order for the any replacement to be human rights compliant and to comply with this convention, the assessment of substantial risk of harm must be included in any replacement. This fundamentally says that a claimant is to be treated as having limited capability for work-related activity or for work if the claimant suffers from some specific disease or bodily or mentally disablement, and by reasons of such disease or disablement there would be a substantial risk to the mental or physical health of any person if the claimant were found not to have limited capability for work-related activity or for work. And we suggest that the form ESA 113, which is sent by the Department of Work and Pensions to a person's general practitioner or consultants, includes within it a direct question to the medical practitioner posing this question in law. This, as far as we can see, will be the only way that we can uphold people's human rights and protect them from being at the mercy of bureaucrats who are asking them to fulfill tasks that they couldn't possibly handle, and therefore having their chronic illness and disability denied in flagrant violation of this convention.
Yes, I'm back on. Sorry, the work strategies. First of all, with employability, vocational training for trade skills is currently restricted to many disabled people because of the minimum academic requirements required for maths and English. That leads to those individuals only being able to get low-skilled, low-paid work. They can communicate and use other technologies for maths and English, which are not acceptable and are really not necessary to gain a trade which will give them a far higher income. Working against stereotypes. Also, sorry, I wanted to add that there's been absolutely no engagement on general comment number 8, none whatsoever, on working against stereotypes, improving visibility of disabled people in industry, in employment, even in senior positions around the civil service would certainly be a benefit. Having publicity campaigns showing the benefit of having disabled people and the diversity of a workforce would certainly be of help, and also offering tax incentives to larger corporations who are failing most to improve the diversity of their workforce in offerance of reduced taxation schemes. Thank you.
We have space for 2 more speakers, please. If anybody wants to take the floor, 2 more speakers.
Mark Harrison from Reclaiming Our Futures Alliance. I'd like to pick up the questions around consultation and the UK government's hostility to the human rights of disabled people, and to this committee. I don't know whether the committee is aware, but after the last inquiry, the British government denied what was written in your inquiry report, and therefore hasn't tried to implement any of the recommendations. To give you an example, a previous Minister for Disabled People, Justin Tomlinson, set up a DPO forum, and that DPO forum had 3 meetings. It refused to take a strategic approach or an approach based on the convention, and then the minister closed down the DPO forum, and there's been no meaningful engagement with DPOs before that or since. I know it's very hard for the committee to understand just how extreme the situation in the UK is, but our government is very hostile to a human rights-based approach, the social model of disability, and the UN Convention itself. Our Prime Minister has refused to attend the UN session in New York, so I think that's all you need to know, really. And in terms of positives, we've asked on many occasions that the government follow General Comment 7 in terms of how it conducts consultations with disabled people's organisations, and it's refused to do that.
Thank you. My name's Kamran Mallick, Disability Rights UK. I just want to pick up on a point that was raised around disabled MPs. There are estimated 14.1 million disabled people approximately in the UK, which if you think about is 21% of the population, with 8% being disabled children, 19% being working age adults, and 44% pension age adults. If these numbers were proportionate to the number of disabled MPs, we should expect to see around 136 disabled MPs. We currently have, with data from 2021-22, 5 MPs who are openly disabled about having a disability. Moreover, the number of openly disabled local authority councillors is around 14%. The government in the past has attempted to bridge this representation gap with something called the Access to Elected Office Fund, which has provided grants between £250 to £40,000 to disabled people running for elected office. From 2012 to 2015, this fund supported 94 applicants and 67 candidates for the total value of just over £400,000. That fund closed. In 2018, they launched a further interim fund called the Enable Fund for elected office, which was established worth £250,000, but that fund too has now closed. On both occasions, the assessments, the independent review of those funds showed the positive impact that the funds could and did have, but the government has continued to refuse to maintain this fund and make it ongoing. In fact, the last fund, the Enable Fund, when it was reviewed, they are refusing to release the report of its findings, and we believe that's because, again, overwhelmingly the review said that it was a successful and much needed fund in the UK to support disabled people into public life.
Thank you. So we have 2 speakers. May we please have a minute each as our time is up.
My name's Keith Lynch. I'm from People for Scotland. I respond to Sir Robert. As well as less money, all the laws could still detain us in mental health hospitals and institutions for years. This prejudice is decades long and continues. Our website countdown clock marks time passing since the government promised to significantly reduce long hospital stays and out-of-area residential placements. Very few months left until the deadline now.
I apologise, I just saw the email. We can't comment. Our comments were Northern Ireland specific. Sorry.
Understand. The last speaker now is done. Okay. Please, if there are any pending questions not yet answered, once again we appeal you submit to us in writing. And I take the opportunity to express my gratitude to all the participants and members of the committee for your active interaction. We now break for 5 minutes for the next session. Thank you very much.